the structural issues in our democracy, and you, with former President Obama, have been leading on that for a long time. One example, Supreme Court here looking at the South Carolina Republicans in a case that's been described as racial gerrymandering. NBC News says Supreme Court backs landmark voting rights law, strikes down the Alabama case. So you got a bunch of these cases running around, and as you have identified, among other things, there's not only the political shamelessness to deny people votes, which has got a long history in this country, but the technology actually makes it even easier to do. Tell us about what you're doing on that front.
Right. We formed up the National Democratic Redistricting Committee back in January of 2017 to really get at this problem of racial and partisan gerrymandering. It's not the, sexiest topic in the world. It deals with the infrastructure of our democracy, and yet it's really important. If you care about a woman's right to choose, if you care about climate, if you care about criminal justice reform, protecting the right to vote, all of this depends on who serves in state legislatures, who serves in the United States House of Representatives, and lines have been drawn in such a way over time that take into account partisan issues, racial issues, and draw lines in such a way that one party is favored over another. After the redistricting that happened in 2011, which Princeton University said was the most gerrymandered of the past 50 years, we saw a decade of Republican-dominated state legislatures that had representation out of proportion to the number of votes that those Republican legislators got. And so we said, let's take this on. Let's simply try to make the system more fair. Because it's my belief that if the system is fair, just fair, Democrats, progressives will do just fine. And so we have been filing lawsuits. We have tried to energize the American people. We have put in place reform measures, independent commissions to draw the lines instead of state legislatures.
Well, wouldn't independent commissions just be the fairest thing writ large?
I think exactly right.
Instead of having politicians pick their own map or their own voters.
Right. That I think is the gold standard and is the thing that I am really committed to trying to do in as many places as we can. And I think that differentiates us from those Republican critics who will say, well, Holder's just trying to do something for Democrats. They will never stand for the creation of these independent commissions, which I think is the best way to do the whole redistricting process.
Yeah. So I got the good news and the bad news. What do you want first?
The good news.
The good news is you have been leading on these criminal justice reform issues for a long time, and I want to play the first time we ever sat down for an interview, which was now over a decade ago, because you were working on that, and we went to a veterans court that took a very simple idea. What if someone has served their country as a veteran and they have a nonviolent offense? Can't there be some other alternative to just throwing them immediately into prison? And that actually had some bipartisan support. The bad news is I want to show a clip of the interview where we talk about something that was one of the enduring criticisms of your tenure, and maybe it's not about you, maybe it's about the system.
Okay.
But this idea that the bankers and the financial elites get away with everything. And I've looked back over this in preparation for this interview. Some of the noise around you at the time doesn't hold up. Particularly some of the clashes with the Congress, particularly, there was a whole meltdown because you said, America's got to face its real problems with race. And people said all sorts of things about you. And then we got MAGA, and I don't think that speech looks like anything. But the way that the bankers and the financial elites seem to get away with everything every time is an enduring issue. So the good news, the bad news all together. Let's take a look.
All right.
You're one of the ninth longest serving attorney general.
Is that right?
That is right.
I didn't know. Okay. All right.
There's been discussion in the economic realm that some institutions are either too big to indict or too big to really deal with in a criminal context.
Let me make this very clear. There are no institutions that are too big to indict.
So you said that, but most of these institutions and many of their leaders seem to get away no matter what. Preet Bharara, who worked for you, has said in New York the same thing you've said, which is it has to do with the law. So now that you're out of government, do these laws need to be strengthened and tightened, or do you think the United States, long-term, including your tenure, is getting it right? When so many Americans feel like, boy, they get in a lot of trouble if they're behind on the rent, or they get evicted, or a million things, and these bankers just walk.
Yeah, I mean, it is a perception that I think is not necessarily accurate, but that does not necessarily mean that there shouldn't be changes made to our laws. Just before I left as Attorney General, I gave a speech at NYU where I detailed about 5 or 6 things that could be put in place to make it easier for prosecutions to occur. I mean, people need to understand something. If we could have brought cases against the head of the largest banks, we would have brought those cases. I mean, these are career-defining cases for the prosecutors who would have brought them, for the attorney general.
That's what Mr. Barrera said. So when you reference the speech you gave, though, that means that Congress actually could be tougher on this.
Yeah, I mean, among other things that I said, you should incentivize people who are within these institutions to share information and reward them financially in the same way we do with the False Claims Act.
But something that we've talked about before, and I know you're passionate about, is, for example, there are these felony murder laws where someone can be in a car and a crime can happen over there. And not only are they charged, they're charged for the taking of the life over there. Now, we understand why that's important, even if that sounds very severe. Is there anything like felony murder liability at the banks?
Not really. I mean, there are, accomplice laws. There's a variety of ways, conspiracy laws that can bring in people who play a minimal role, but nevertheless an important role.
Because, again, I only mean to interrupt to get to it. We hear a lot about, you guys couldn't meet the individual criminal intent, which I get, because banks are complex organizations, and they deliberately obscure. But what about having a law that says you ought to know better, and you're going to be on the hook to some degree if you see all this money coming in and all this other shenanigans, and it doesn't look right? You got to have some. You're not a random person. You're a financial professional.
No, I think that's exactly right. And one of the things I talked about was kind of a Sarbanes-Oxley criminal component. Where you look at what happens in corporate America, what you look at happens in financial institutions, and come up with statutes that are designed specifically to deal with those issues. I think there is a way in which we can make our laws stronger and bring to justice greater numbers of people who are involved in these financial frauds. And it's important that we do so, because we can't have this notion that there is a two-tiered justice system. I laugh at that when I hear Donald Trump and his supporters talk about a two-tiered system of justice. That's not even close to the truth. But the reality is that, in fact, there is some basis to think that if you are a person of color or poor, you're treated differently than somebody who is white and rich.
So